So in a sense, the Republican Party represented a really interesting paradox. In the North, the Republican Party had attracted the most influential and profitable bankers, merchants, large farmers. So up north, the Republicans were the most educated and the wealthiest people. In the South, however, it was mostly poor African Americans and a few poor whites who voted for the Republican Party. And of course, that's something as a paradox. In the South, the Republicans were poor, mostly illiterate, powerless, and largely black. Right? So the Republican Party, what happens is that it is being artificially propped up in the South by the fact that the Union Army is still present in the South, for one thing. And secondly, white folks are still largely not allowed to vote because they have not been pardoned for their treasonable activity of taking part in the Civil War on the part of the secessionists. Nevertheless, white people in the South saw the Union and the Republican Party as occupying forces sent down from the North to try and dramatically alter their political system, and they were, as you might well guess, very upset about this. And of course, most whites in the South were absolutely opposed to black people having rights and the Republican Party. So what ends up happening, of course, is that white folks in the South organize into these paramilitary secret groups to try and scare the Republicans into submission. Both black people, but also scalawags and carpetbaggers, northern whites who had come to the South hoping to promote economic development and run for political office. And these people were especially targeted by the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan, and the Knights of the White Camellia, or the White Brotherhood, or the White Caps, the Ku Klux Klan were not the only paramilitary white supremacist group in the South during Reconstruction. They used threats, intimidation, beatings, rape, murder to try and restore conservative, white, democratic rule and force black people into submission. You can think of the Ku Klux Klan and other similar white supremacist groups as the sort of paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party. Of course, the Ku Klux Klan is the most famous of any of these groups. It was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1866. Originally, it was a social club for ex-Confederates, but quickly it took on a much more militant and violent tone. The most famous early Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan was, of course, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who we met during our discussions of the battles of the Civil War. He became a Grand Wizard, and actually the Klan, despite the fact that, oftentimes wealthy Southerners would try and say that the Ku Klux Klan was made up of the rabble, poor whites. The truth of the matter is that the Ku Klux Klan actually drew members from all classes of white society, and it quickly became a political force in the South, a sort of military arm of the Democratic Party. And the Ku Klux Klan was particularly relevant and active in areas with large black minorities, like western Alabama, northern Georgia, and the panhandle of Florida. In the Carolina and Georgia Low Country, right, where there was a majority of African Americans, the Ku Klux Klan actually rarely appeared. It was more in areas where there were black and white people living together that the Ku Klux Klan was most active. So the Ku Klux Klan, they were a political organization in the sense that they tried to intimidate black and white Republican voters into not participating in politics. The Ku Klux Klan also enforced labor on the plantations as well. Remember, labor is one of the major issues that we have facing America during Reconstruction. Now, the Republican governments, which were put in place by scalawags, carpetbaggers, and a handful of black voters in the South, tried to resist the efforts of the Ku Klux Klan, but they were largely ineffectual because, of course, the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups were more than likely supported by a majority of white Southerners who very much resented the fact that not only had they lost the Civil War, but now they were being occupied by what they deemed a foreign army, and forced to adopt political forms which betrayed the basic tenets of white supremacy. in the South, a lot of the troops were still African Americans. During the Civil War, African Americans, who didn't always see as much combat duty as white troops, were often put on occupation duties where they would be put into the cities in order to enforce order. And African American soldiers gladly participated in this because they thought that, in a sense, they were helping to remake these southern cities into a post-Civil War, more egalitarian places. Alas, they were largely wrong. And the fact that black men in uniform were present in southern places, in southern cities, drew the ire of white Southerners who still stung from the defeat of the Confederacy, and oftentimes militias made up of white men would confront black soldiers, black federal soldiers being confronted by paramilitary groups. And, as is the case in various places throughout the South, the white paramilitary troops often won in these conflicts. Ku Klux Klan terrorism even interrupted the 1868 election, where they came out to intimidate black voters who were trying to cast ballots for Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Nathan Bedford Forrest supposedly tried to disband the Ku Klux Klan in 1869, but the fact that it was so dispersed, the fact that the membership of the Ku Klux Klan was largely secret, was probably also its greatest strength. The 1868 election comes around, and of course the radical Republicans had to run somebody more moderate because the radical Republicans were seen as going too far in the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. And they settled upon Ulysses S. Grant, who, while a victorious general in defeating the South, was seen as more moderate, more interested in reunification with the South than dramatically remaking Southern society. And Ulysses S. Grant won in a landslide because Democrats largely could not vote in the South. It's not until 1872 that white people who had participated in the Confederacy generally regained their right to participate in politics. So the 1868 election, Grant, a Republican, does very well in the South, but precisely because he is supported in the South by the only people that can vote, black people who have recently won the right to vote, not nationally, but in the states. In order for the states to reconstitute and to form new state governments, they had to allow black men the right to vote. So in the South, 1868 saw many black men turning out to vote, but they also saw the Ku Klux Klan coming out in no small way to try and prevent those black people from voting. Now, Grant does win, right? The Democrats still are kind of tarred with this brush of, having led the South into secession. Not every Democrat was a secessionist, but every secessionist was a Democrat, was the way that the Republican slogan went. The Republicans, for the rest of the century, actually would wave the so-called bloody shirt and remind Northerners and other Republicans of the many sacrifices that the Union had made in order to bring the Confederacy back into the United States. And they were able to win. But of course, the election was marked by all kinds of fraud, and it was hotly contested in the South. And it became clear, despite the fact that black people were, able to vote in the South and many white people were not able to vote in the South, it became clear to the Republican Party that the only reason that they won the South was because the majority of white people still could not vote. This was a problem for the Republican Party, who wanted to build a base in the South. They knew that they would not be able to disenfranchise white people who had participated in the Confederacy forever. So how would they build support in the South amongst white people? They tried to turn towards economic matters rather than matters of reform and Reconstruction, especially once leading radical Republican Thaddeus Stevens died in 1868. The Republicans started to embrace, under Ulysses S. Grant, a lot more economic and financial issues intended to grow the economy. Of course, they also became more corrupt as a result. Most famously, the Public Credit Act promised to pay the national debt in gold, and this was a measure enacted under Ulysses S. Grant during his first administration. And many of the financiers and bankers who had helped lend money to the government during the war still had not been paid back in full. Well, what happens is that this Public Credit Act promises that they'll be paid back, and not only paid back, but paid back in gold as well. So what does that mean? That people who had bought war bonds and invested in the Union during the Civil War were about to be paid back, big time. People like J.P. Morgan, who had invested in the war effort and bought government bonds, would be paid back in specie rather than less valuable greenbacks. But probably the greatest accomplishment of Ulysses S. Grant's administration was the 15th Amendment, which finally makes it a federal law that all men, regardless of whether, whatever their race was, now have the right to vote. And the reason that the Republicans were so interested in pursuing this course of action was because the Republicans realized that they could not win southern states unless African Americans had a secure right to vote in the South. So what they do is they prohibit any state government from denying suffrage based upon race. Now, this 15th Amendment was bitterly opposed by the Democrats, but it was ultimately adopted in 1869 without the unreconstructed states' approval, right? There's still some states which have not even formed a quote-unquote sham government under the Republicans and stay out of the Union. Well, they get no say on the amendment, and the 15th Amendment is passed, supported by the northern states as well as the southern states who have been allowed to form new governments based upon universal suffrage already. They also vote to pass the 15th Amendment. And, the 15th Amendment is, of course, a landmark in this unfinished revolution to ensure that African Americans have full, equal, and political rights in the South. But it's also a political measure. The Republican Party was so interested in passing suffrage for black men because the Republicans realized that if they did not have the support of African Americans in the South, they would not be able to win elections in the South. In fact, the greatest beneficiaries of this amendment were black people in the North. Actually, most black people in the North were still not allowed to vote because of various prejudiced and racist state laws, barring them from having the right to vote. At last, because of the 15th Amendment, up north, all black people would have the right to vote just as they did in the South, nationwide. The people who were most alienated by this 15th Amendment were, of course, women suffragettes. Women who had been part of the abolitionist movement for the previous 30, 40 years and had fought alongside their black allies to try and get full political rights passed and to abolish slavery. When they saw that only men won the right to vote, they were understandably disappointed. In a famous debate between Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass applauded the government for passing the 15th Amendment, and of course, Susan B. Anthony was very upset that they had. And in her response to Frederick Douglass saying, well, this is a step in the right direction. We can continue to fight, but we've accomplished a lot here. And of course, Susan B. Anthony responds by saying that half of the people cannot vote. Not only that, it's the more intelligent half that cannot vote.